Hello everyone. Today we are looking at what the components of an argument are. Kind of the basics of what makes an argument and what is not an argument. So that is our topic for today. What we're going to start off with is kind of just assessing what is not an argument, so then we can get into the components of an argument. So one of the things that is can be difficult, not always, some are obvious, and we're going to see some here that are very obvious and others that are not, is that if we look at what critical thinking and an argument is, it is that it has to, in that statement or passage, contain some kind of premise and conclusion. And we're going to talk more about this. We're going to come back to this here. Let me put this up here with that. I should have set that up first, right? So an argument has to have both a premise and or more. It can have more than one premise. Okay, so you can have multiple premises or one, but it has to have at least a premise and a conclusion. So that this provides the argument that there's something actually arguable to prove, essentially, right? One of the things then is being able to identify what is not an argument so that it's easy to set those aside. And there can be tricky, again, we're going to look at some, these are kind of some of the more obvious ones, but they can get complex where a sentence can somewhat be disguised to look like an argument, but not fully fit that requirement of such. So a statement then is, and here I've got the conclusion and premises are formed through statements. That's also the other component of this. Arguments are made up of statements, and statements are sentences, and so they're naturally part of the argument, but statements alone are not arguments. That's kind of the way to think of it is right here. Statements alone do not make an argument. All right. Now, statements are important, though, in making it up when they do, because statements are what provide the reasons to believe, right? Whether something is true or not. And so the key with statements too is identifying a statement. And we're going to see this actually in all of the areas we're looking at today. And I think this is where it can get complex because we want to I think naturally be like, okay, well, that's false, so therefore it's irrelevant or it's not a statement. So we're going to see that statements and arguments, premises and conclusions, there can be valid, invalid ones, and they don't always have to be true factually, right? Statements can also be true or false factually, and they're still considered statements. So some of the examples I have here, it's below 40 degrees outside. I like broccoli. Time travel is possible. Oklahoma is north of Texas. I shouldn't eat French fries, right? It doesn't matter whether it's true or false, right? The statement, it still is considered a statement, right? You can, and it can be something that, like, I like broccoli as a personal thing, where you're sharing something that is about what your opinion or feelings, and in that sense, it's somewhat the truth is subjective to you. Or like, I'm cold, right? But if you have something where you say, the sky is green, let's say, right? Well, that is a statement. It can be proven false, but it still is considered a statement. These are the straightforward statements, right? These are things that are simply straightforward sentences. You are a liar. You are not a liar. Rap music is better than punk music. Now, since statements can lead to arguments, the rap music is better than punk music, for example, that in itself is not an argument. But that statement being said could lead people to expand on that and end up making an argument. Whereas if you just say, I like broccoli, there's less likely to lead to an argument with that. I suppose anything could technically lead to developing an argument from a statement, but it's like there are clear statements that are likely to lead to arguments and ones that are not. I shouldn't eat French fries, for example, it is a personal statement, but you can look for these, right? If you're trying to determine if something is a statement versus an argument, one of the indicators is if it's just a single sentence, it's probably not an argument, because it's unlikely that you've included the premise and the conclusion within just that. However, if it's made up of multiple statements, right, and you see certain ones that have indicators that it could lead to an argument, you can at least use those to then explore further, versus if you see something where it just says it is below 40 degrees outside, it's unlikely that's expanding beyond that this is probably just going to be giving what we'll see is a list of facts. Again, technically any of these can be built into in a passage leading to an argument. But if you look for those indicators, it can help you quickly identify statements versus arguments. There's also different types of statements, right? Declarative sentences, and exclamatory sentences like "you're awesome" or "you're such a liar," right? As it mentions there. Negative statements, "I will not go," "I didn't see him today." This is less important. This is interesting to know in terms of like the different types, but it's more about whether or not there is something that could lead to a premise and conclusion, or is just simply a statement that, whether true or false, doesn't go beyond that. Now, there are also other types of non-arguments that are not statements. So not every sentence or passage is a statement or argument, right? And it's important to make sure that you realize that in that sense of, as I was mentioning, that just because something might look like an argument doesn't mean that it is. And again, there's a variety of these type of ones that can, some that are more obvious than others. So if we look at like pictures, for example, pictures, they are not, there's no premise, conclusion, or argument in a picture or a movie, for example, right? You have to have, again, go back to those two parts, the premise and conclusion. Pictures and movies can be compelling, beautiful, complex, realistic, but they are not either true or false. They can cause you to have an opinion or an argument or form a judgment, but it's not that leads to the argument. It's not the argument itself, right? Another one is if-then sentences. If you wash your car now, then it will get spots, for example, that we have here, right? These ones, if-then sentences, can sound like arguments, and in fact can sometimes be a premise to an argument, right? So this is why this one can get tricky, because you can see these in a premise of an argument, right? But by itself, it's not enough, right? So if you wash your car now, then it will get dirty right away. Or if you wash your car now, it will get spots, is not enough for an argument because there's no conclusion, right? But if you wash your car now, then it will get dirty right away. Therefore, you should not wash your car right now. Then you can have a connection to the conclusion of it's raining, right? So if it's raining, if you wash your car right now, it will get dirty right away. Therefore, you should not wash your car right now. You have that connection. But in of itself, it's not an argument. I would say that this is the one that I think a lot of times people will see and be like, oh, that's an argument. But it has to have more than just that one part. A list of facts can also sometimes feel like an argument. And the key is identifying when it is just a list of facts, right? For example, I have here on this one, the number of people who have learned how to steal identities has doubled in the past year. You are now more likely to become a victim of identity theft than you were a year ago. So this does somewhat sound like there is an argument to it. And the information from sentence to sentence, right, is related, right? Each of them is related to the same subject. However, none of the claims listed as a reason for believing another. So there's no argument. So again, why it can sound like it is because it's a lot of different facts that are being provided and they're all related. But of all these list of facts and claims, none are making a connection for why should you believe that, right? What is the conclusion essentially? So here's the difference, right? And how that works. Like if you had a similar passage, that would be the difference with this. So I'll read the first one, this one again, right here. Okay, the number of people who have learned how to steal identities has doubled in the past year. You are now more likely to become a victim of identity theft than you were a year ago, right? List of facts. Now, here's a similar passage that is an argument. The number of people who have learned how to steal identities has doubled in the past year. So you are now more likely to become a victim of identity theft than you were a year ago. They're very similar, right? And so that's where this can be tricky because they seem very, very similar, right? What is the difference here if we look at this? The number of people who have learned how to steal identities has doubled in the past year. So you are now more likely to become a victim of identity theft than you were a year ago, right? The first part is the premise. The second part is the conclusion. Whereas the number of people who have learned how to steal identities has doubled in the past year. You are now more likely to become a victim of identity theft than you were a year ago. The difference is, and it's subtle, right? So the number of people who have learned how to steal identities in the past has doubled in the past year. That's like fact number one. You are now more likely to become a victim of identity theft than you were a year ago. That's the second fact, right? Versus, again, I should have probably typed this one up so you could see the difference in person. It is in the notes, though. The number of people who have learned how to steal identities has doubled in the past year. We got that, right? So you are now more likely to become a victim of identity than you were a year ago. It's super different. It's super subtle, right? It's the so. So this idea of, right, they're connecting it versus I'm just listing facts. And that's that it's super, super subtle. So the list of facts, it doesn't take much to make it an argument, right? It's just a little tweak here and there can make a difference. And we'll look at these arguments versus non-arguments here too in just a minute when we go through the list. So if you see a list of facts, the key is there a clear connecting piece that makes one a premise and one a conclusion versus just a list of facts, right? By adding that, basically, so you are now this is what's going to happen. It's connected in saying that because the number of people who've learned to steal identities has increased, that has caused you to be likely to become a victim of identity. And that's the only difference, right? Versus this one, which has the same information, but is just listing it. Now, the next one is A because of B, right? So in this one, the word we're going to look at, the word because is often a good indicator that it refers to the cause of something, but it doesn't always. So it's a good starting point. If you see the word because in a passage, you should then take further steps to determine if it's an argument. But know that because doesn't always make one an argument, that you can't automatically just say, oh, there's an argument, I'm good to go. So we have an example here. Mike is in his swimsuit because he was swimming. Now, if we add another one, Mike was swimming because he's in his swimsuit. The two sentences are also very similar, right? The first sentence explains why Mike is wearing a swimsuit. Mike is in his swimsuit because he was swimming. This is an explanation. Sorry, it's a little hard to read with the brown there, but that's an explanation, right? And then the next one, Mike was swimming because he's in his swimsuit. The second one, that one I just read, offers an argument about that Mike was swimming, right? Mike is in a swimsuit because he was swimming versus Mike was swimming because he's in a suit. So we can conclude that Mike was swimming because he was in a swimsuit, where the other one is just explaining why Mike was in his swimsuit. Again, it can be tricky because both sentences and arguments use the idea of A because of B. And when that follows because, it's a reason for accepting a contention of the argument, right? Because is usually like that cause and effect idea. Again, you just have to pay attention to, is it explaining something, or is it offering an argument for why something is taking place, right? We're deducing that Mike was swimming because he was in a swimsuit, where the other is stating that Mike was in a swimsuit because he was swimming. Very similar. This is where, like I said, then when there's the obvious sentences and statements and non-arguments that you'll be able to pick out right away. And then there's the more subtle ones that are harder, that take a little bit more breaking down the sentence, which we'll look at next topic. We're going to be looking at mapping and how do you map out an argument to break it down so that you can determine this. Okay, so that, don't worry, that will be our next topic. Is we're going to look at mapping and ordering to break down sentences and statements and passages to be able to determine if they're an argument, because I think these are the ones that are tricky, that then can become complicated when you're trying to figure it out. And then there's questions, commands, requests, proposals, right? These top ones here. Questions are asking something. They're not making an argument, right? What time is it? There's no argument there. The questions are usually pretty easy. If it's just a question by itself, right? What do you think about the presidential election? There's a question that can lead to an argument, but it's just asking. There's nothing being argued. It's just asking a question. Commands are telling someone to do something. Please clean the kitchen. Go do your laundry. Whatever it is, right? The please clean the kitchen is a nice command. They can be harsh commands. Do it now, right? But it's telling someone to do something. It's not giving any reason why. Now, if they move it to like, you should clean the kitchen today, because, and then provide that the reason for that, then you can move it into an argument. But if it's just a straight command that's telling someone to do something, then it doesn't move any further. And then proposals, let's go to the museum tomorrow. Again, similar kind of thing, right? It's simply making a suggestion of what to do for the following day. This can be made into an argument if they provide a premise or conclusion to argue why you should go to the museum the following day. So again, this can end up being part of an argument, but by itself, if you're just making a suggestion to do something, or a proposal for what should be done, right? You should do your homework. That it's not enough for an argument. And then I think that's the commands, request, proposals. I think we got them all. So these are all different types of, again, non-arguments that aren't considered statements. They're sentences. So not all sentences are arguments or statements, essentially, is the key with this. And then knowing that these type of ones, that some of these, especially, again, if, then, list of facts, and A because of B, can be tricky. I think most people will get questions and won't have a problem identifying questions, commands, requests, or proposals or things like that. I don't think that's going to be the problem, like the where you're going to find issues. I think it's going to be with the if, then, sentences, list of facts, and A because of B. But it is important to know that not everything is considered a statement either. They just give you a few more examples of arguments versus not, and they're connected, right? So it's raining. If it's raining, it's above freezing. If it's above freezing, you shouldn't go ice skating, right? Versus it's raining outside and it's melting all the ice and snow. Chocolate cake contains sugar, and sugar is delicious. Therefore, chocolate cake is delicious, right? There's one of the indicator words we're going to look at for the argument versus this is just a list of instructions, right? Mix flour, egg, milk, cocoa solids, butter, and sugar. Last, apply chocolate frosting. The science on vaccines consistently demonstrates pronounced safety and effectiveness. You should vaccinate, right? The conclusion is you should vaccinate because of these things. Vaccines train our immune system to create proteins that fight disease, just as would happen when we are exposed to a disease, right? This is a explanation, information, versus having, if you look at each of these, right? It's raining. If it's raining, it's above freezing. If it's above freezing, you shouldn't go ice skating, right? So then you have the you shouldn't go ice skating because of that, versus it's just raining outside. So hopefully you see that connection between the argument or statements and other non-arguments that are not statements. So let's get into now looking at specifically the two parts of an argument and talking about how you then determine these. And I mentioned it was the premise and conclusion. And this is what you should be looking for, is that you have to have these two parts, right? If you don't have these two parts, you don't have an argument, right? These two parts are necessary to get to where you have an argument in place. And so that's what we're always trying to look for when you're trying to determine if something is an argument or not. Right, and so these two conditions the argument have, right? At least one of the statements must claim to present evidence or reason. That's the premise. There must be a claim that the alleged evidence supports or implies something. That is, a claim that something follows from the alleged evidence or reason, which is a conclusion. So let's look at the premise first. Premises, and there can be more than one, right? So you can have one premise or you can have multiple, are statements being offered in support of the conclusion, right? The premise also embody the reasons or facts providing evidence for the conclusion's credibility. It tells us why we should agree or believe the conclusion, essentially. Premise, raising the speeding limit will wear out the highway faster. Here's a second premise. In addition, doing so will result in more highway deaths. Conclusion, therefore, we should not raise the speed limit, right? So if you have this idea of we should not raise the speed limit, here is the reasons why. All right, so that's what you're looking for in that. Now, it is important to know that the premises don't have to actually have factual evidence or be true. It just has to support the conclusion. Basically, it must claim to present evidence or reasons, and there must be a claim that the evidence of reasons support or implies something. This is, I think, I'll put that here, right? Premise does not have to be factual or true. And this is sometimes the hard part of this, because we want to assume that if someone's making an argument that it means it has to be true. But if you're looking at we're going to look at how that breaks down and what's valid and what's not within that. But this idea is that it doesn't have to be or it doesn't have to have actual evidence. I probably should change it to that's, I think, clearer. Have actual evidence or be true, right? You don't have to, you can eventually decide that an argument is not logical because the premise is invalid or is not true, but it technically can still be considered an argument even if the premise is faulty, right? So that's a key aspect of it. The key for then basically using a premise and determining an argument is deciding whether it has fulfilled the purpose of being in support of the conclusion. Right? So, for example, we don't have you don't also have to know if it's always true, right? Raising the speed limit will wear out the highways faster. You could agree with that, but right, do you have the data to support that? Because what if what if it actually didn't, what if raising the speed limit doesn't actually increase the number of deaths, right? For this, it doesn't take away from the fact that this is still an argument, right? Someone else could then come and respond to us and say, actually, this is, studies have proven that raising the speed limit doesn't increase deaths. But for the purpose of determining an argument, it doesn't matter whether that statement is true or false, right? Because it still supports their conclusion, which is we should not raise the speed limit. So hopefully that makes sense in how that works. Within a premise and stuff, there you have this idea of an inferential claim. And an inferential claim is that the passage expresses a certain kind of reasoning process, that something supports or implies something. Inferential claims can be, I don't have space here, inferential claims can be both explicit or implicit. We'll come back to the premise indicators in a minute. So let me put that right here, the inferential claim. And we'll say explicit or implicit, just so you have that. Okay, so an explicit claim is usually asserted by a premise or conclusion indicator, which is where we're getting into these that we're going to look at. Thus, since, because, hence, therefore. We're going to go through these in just a minute with all of them. So an example sentence would be, mad cow disease is spread by feeding parts of infected animals to cows, and this practice has yet to be completely eradicated. Thus, mad cow disease continues to pose a threat to people who eat beef. Right? The word thus expresses the claim that something is being inferred. So the passage is an argument. Sorry. The indicator words help you identify too whether something is a premise or a conclusion. And we're also going to look at other tips for how to determine that. But an implicit claim, right, is where there is the relationship between the statements in the passage, but you don't have indicator words. So one of the things as we're looking at these indicator words here in just a minute is, we'll put it right here, right? Arguments do not need to have indicator words. They just often do. So this is like one of the first steps for if you're like, how do I determine if something's an argument? Look for indicator words. A good chunk of the time, arguments have them. But you can't then immediately dismiss and say this is not an argument because there is no indicator word, right? Because there can be arguments that don't use indicator words. So we saw with the first one, the mad cow disease is spreading by feeding parts of infected animals to cows, and this practice has yet to be completely eradicated, right? The premise, and then thus, mad cow disease continues to pose a threat to people who eat it. Now, here's an example of implicit claim that does not have that. The genetic modification of food is risky business. Genetic engineering can introduce unintended changes into the DNA of the food-producing organism, and these changes can be toxic to the consumer. Right? So here you don't have a clear-cut indicator to make it as obvious. The inferential relationship between the first statement and the other two provides the implicit claim that evidence supports something. Right? So we can call this an argument. The first statement is the conclusion, and the other two are the premise, right? So the genetic modification of food is risky business. That's the conclusion. So this is where it can be tricky. A lot of time, premises will come first, but they don't have to. You can have conclusions first in a sentence, right? And then, so that's the conclusion. Then the premise, genetic engineering can produce unintended changes into the DNA of the food-producing organism. And then the next premise, these changes can be toxic to the consumer. Therefore, the genetic modification of food is risky business. Now, I added the therefore. This is one of the tips that you can use, right? If it doesn't have an indicator word, can you add it and it makes sense? Right? That's one way to kind of, when we'll see that with because here in a minute. It's one way to test it. If you're unsure, read through it and then add the indicator word and say, does this make sense? Right? Does this work with that? And it also helps you determine a premise or a conclusion too, right? If I said the genetic modification of food is risky business, therefore Genetic engineering can introduce unintended changes into the DNA of the food producing organism, and these changes can be toxic. That doesn't sound right? Because the genetic modification of food is risky business doesn't actually, if we go back to here for a second, right? The premise is the statement being offered in support of the conclusion, right? So if I said genetic modification of food is risky business, therefore genetic engineering, blah, 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 right? It should come up and be like, well, that doesn't actually support what I was thinking might be the conclusion. That doesn't make sense. However, if I then read the other part, which I did, right, and then say, therefore, genetic modification of food is risky business, it does make sense. And then those other two sentences clearly support the conclusion. So just because while you're often are going to see a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator words, right? Just because you don't see it doesn't mean you can dismiss it as an argument right off the bat. You can then add in the indicator words to help you determine if something is an argument. So here are a bunch of common premise indicators. Because works for both in view of the fact, given that, seeing that, as, due to the fact, being that, since, assuming that, for the reason that, in so much as, for the reason being, this is implied by. There's some other ones too. These are the most common ones that you'll see, right? If you see these words, it is a good sign that it is an argument. Again, you can't 100% prove just because someone throws in an indicator word that it's actually going to be an argument. It just is more likely to be. And this is very much a very useful tool to start assessing an argument, is looking for these indicator words and then systematically going from there. So an example here, right? Either Stacy is rich or her parents are, since she drives a Porsche, right? So the premise is the claim that Stacy drives a Porsche. The conclusion is that either Stacy or her parents are rich, right? If you look at the indicator word, there we go, sense, right? That which also then tells you, since it's here, right, there's the premise. This is the conclusion, right? So that by finding the indicator words, it can help you determine not only if it is an argument, but actually where the premise versus conclusion is. All right, now conclusions is the statement being argued, right? It's what's being argued in the passage or statement. So for this, right, the world will end on August 6th, 2045. I know this because my dad told me so, and my dad is smart. Now, this is a good example of, it's not a strong argument, right, but the conclusion is the world will end. And then the premise, just like a good indicator word, I know this because, right, my dad told me, and my dad is smart. Another example, raising the speed limit will waste gas. We don't have gas to waste. Therefore, we should not raise the speed limit. So you can see the conclusion. The conclusion is pretty straightforward, right? It's the position of the person speaking or writing. And it's meant to be the conclusion of whatever the argument, like based on these facts or information, this is what the answer is, or this is what you have to then conclude. These are good examples, though, of how to kind of locate the conclusions, right? It is the position of the writer or speaker. Look at the beginning or ending, this is important because usually the conclusion is at the very first sentence or the last sentence. If someone is not a good writer and they're writing all over the place, technically a conclusion could be in the middle, but most of the time it's either the first sentence or the last sentence, right? So if you have a paragraph, you need to read closely, look for those two locations first. Then there's the indicator words we're going to look at. This is a good one too. Ask what is being claimed, and then also look to the title if there is a title. Which a lot of times we're just looking at sentences here. There isn't going to be a title. But if you're reading a paper or something else that has a title, it can give you sometimes clues to what the conclusion is going to be. But that asking yourself, okay, if I'm reading this passage, what's the point? What are they trying to prove? Right? And if you're reading through raising the speed limit will waste gas, you could say, well, maybe they're trying to say it's wasting gas. But then the next premise is we don't have gas to waste. Right? Is that, okay, that they're not trying to talk about, the conclusion isn't we will waste gas. It has to be this next part, which is it should not raise the speed limit because, here's the other way to do it, right? We should not raise the speed limit because the speed limit will waste gas. Right? We don't have gas to waste. So trying to ask, like, okay, what is if the world will end on August 6, 2045? I know this because my dad told me and my dad is smart. So what's being claimed? That they know this. What do they know? Well, I know this, which is this statement. And my dad is smart. What do they know? That the world will end. That can be then how you know that connection to the conclusion. Again, indicator words can be helpful with this. Therefore, thus. You see therefore, thus a lot. Hints. Which implies that consequently it follows that we can conclude that so accordingly, hence it must be as a result, which means that ergo this shows that, this suggests that, this proves that. You see these are often used to make it clear with that connection. Again, anything that's going to be explicit is almost always going to have an indicator word. You just have to look out for those implicit ones that don't have indicator words. But the key is just add them yourself. Work through the sentences and add those indicator words yourself and see where it makes sense. Where does it actually work to make that argument with those indicator words, and where does it not? Right? When you're deciding whether there's a claim that whether there's evidence that supports or implies something, though looking for those indicator words and the presence of the inferential relationship between the statements helps you determine that argument. That's that part, right? But again, indicator words are not automatic guarantee of a presence of an argument, because I could just throw in a bunch of these and not actually have a claim. So it helps provide a starting point. Think of it as a starting point when you're trying to figure out if something's an argument. You have a checklist of things that you should do, and one of those is look at for the indicator words and see what does it tell you, right? The other thing to think about with premises and conclusion is that there can be unstated ones. So arguments can contain unstated premises. Let me go back to this. We'll put it here. Unstated premise. Right? So you can have something that's unstated, which makes it harder to determine if it's an argument, essentially, right? So, for example, here's a premise and conclusion. So here, you can't check out books from the library without an ID. Bill won't be able to check out any books. Okay? So the unstated premise is that Bill has no ID. You have one premise. You can't check out books from the library without an ID. But there's a secondary unstated premise, which is Bill has no ID. Therefore, Bill won't be able to check out any books. These are often found in the real world, unstated premises. Usually there's, you have to have some aspect, but there's often where you'd be like, there's actually a secondary premise. But because it's obvious, if I'm saying you can't check out books from the library without an ID, therefore Bill will not be able to check out any books, the only assumption is that Bill doesn't have his ID, right? Now, maybe if they were being more specific, you say, well, Bill doesn't have an ID anywhere versus Bill forgot his ID at home. But in terms of just the obvious, right? If I'm saying you can't check out books from the library without an ID, therefore Bill won't be able to check out any books today. That would be the unstated premise is Bill doesn't have an ID because otherwise he'd be able to check out books. Again, these are often found in the real world because it's essentially it seems too obvious to have to add that extra sentence. If I'm talking to someone and I go, oh, you're not going to be able to check out any books from the library today, or, oh, you have to, sorry, let me say the sentence correctly. So if I'm talking to someone, I'm like, oh man, you can't check books out from the library without an ID, so Bill won't be able to check out books today. I don't need to say because Bill doesn't have his ID. But when I'm talking to someone and saying that, the assumption is clearly that the reason is that the other premise is Bill doesn't have his ID. So the way you're most likely to see is unstated premises in the wild, if you will, out in the real world. So often like that's it's with some other premise, and it's usually because that premise is super, super obvious. So it would be weird for in a conversation for someone to state that. People are like, yeah, got it. That would be the kind of response to those if you were like going to state every single one. But the other aspect is, if we go back to conclusions here, right, there can be unstated conclusions as well. These are less frequent. They still happen, but unstated premise is way more common than an unstated conclusion in real life, right? So example, here's the unstated conclusion. The political party that best reflects mainstream opinion will win the presidency, and the Republican Party best reflects mainstream opinion. Right, so what is the unstated conclusion? It's that the Republican Party will win the presidency. Right, the political party that best reflects mainstream opinion will win the presidency, and the Republican Party best reflects mainstream opinion. So they have the conclusion that the Republican Party best reflects mainstream opinion here. You have that part, right? That's that part of that statement. Sorry, but the conclusion is if the Republican Party best reflects the mainstream opinion, and the political party that best reflects mainstream opinion will win the presidency, therefore the Republican Party will win the presidency, right? It's this idea of essentially it's repetitive. Usually when you see unstated premise or conclusion, it's because it comes off as repetitive if you are stating it because that connection or claim has already been made. Again, something just to look for. And all of these is like, here's the best tips, but there are some other aspects, which is again why when we go and start doing the mapping, it will also help with determining what is an argument and what is not. Now, there are other types. There's heuristics for identifying premises and conclusions. Essentially, again, this deconstructing arguments is the best way to figure out what the conclusion is, and even what the premise is and stuff. Usually, there's only one conclusion in arguments, so if we can identify the conclusion, usually it means the rest of the passage is the premise. So these are tips for trying to identify the conclusion. And I would agree. I think the conclusion is easier to pick out first sometimes than what a premise is. Part indicator words. Use the indicator words to help you do so. It's going to make things easier. These four heuristics are ways that you can also help identify what an argument is by trying to identify the conclusion, right? So the first is look for the most controversial statement in an argument. That the conclusion usually is going to be the most controversial statement in the argument. Arguments that move from assertions or premise that whoever's listening agrees with, then showing them how these assertions apply to something that the audience might not have previously agreed with. That's like part of the point of the argument, is this idea that if you're trying to prove or argue something to someone, you set up and provide the premise or multiple premises with things that people are like, yeah, okay, this is a fact, this is a fact. Therefore, if you look at those together, this tells us, right? And usually if it's a super obvious conclusion, you aren't making the argument in the first place. So sometimes people do, but often when people are making arguments, they're trying to convince people of that conclusion. And so it tends to be the more controversial statement that not everyone's going to agree with, because you don't have an argument if there's nothing that you have to prove. Then it goes back to those statements, right? Where it's just a sentence being like the sky is blue. What is there to argue with that, right? Now, if I wanted to say that the sky is green and then provide more connections to assertions, if you will, to then create a conclusion, right? That this, and this prove that the sky is green. Then you have something that people could argue against. So that's why it's often easy to try to look for the most controversial statement, because it's not always, but often is the conclusion. The next one is the conclusion is usually a statement that takes a position on an issue, right? The premise is the reason that supports the position on the issue, which is the conclusion. So again, the premise is the reasons that support the position, which is the conclusion. Premise equals the reasons, right, of that support the position, which equals the conclusion. So if you are looking for the statement that takes the position, it's likely to be the conclusion. The conclusion is usually, although not always, the first or last statement in the argument, which we already mentioned, but it's one of these that's like, use these 4 heuristics to try to determine the conclusion. And then you have the because test. Now, the because test, again, is also something that doesn't always work, because we looked at A because of B. There can be the word because and it not be an argument. So any of these, I mean, anyone could argue that any of these 4 things here does not guarantee an argument. They're just makes it very likely that you can then identify the conclusion with these. If you're using these tips, the majority of the time, you'll be able to pick out what the conclusion is from that. But with because, just to set it up, because it doesn't always work with that, right? But how do you use the because test, right? The premise always supports the conclusion. Therefore, you should be able to add in because into the sentence to help you determine what that connection is. So I'll give you an example, right? With that, it is a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit. It tastes delicious. Also, lots of Facebook posts say that it cures cancer. So I'm trying to figure out what the conclusion is here, right? It's a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit. It tastes delicious. Also, lots of Facebook posts say that it causes cancer, or cures cancer, not causes, sorry. So you're trying to figure out what the conclusion is, but you're having trouble. Well, we know it tastes delicious, or hopefully you should know it's just a statement, right? It tastes delicious. So that's not the conclusion. So we have, it's a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit, and lots of Facebook posts say that it cures cancer. So which one of those is the conclusion, right? So what you can do is add the word because. So there's 2. We have 2 that we don't know which it is. So let's do the first one here, where we'll start with, it's a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit as the premise because, or of lots of people, sorry, let me read that again. It's a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit because lots of Facebook posts say that it cures cancer. Or lots of Facebook posts say that Amazonian jungle fruit cures, I keep wanting to say causing, cures cancer because it makes it good to eat, because it's a good idea to eat lots of it. So we added because in both of those, where we took the 2 where we didn't know which was the conclusion. It's a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit because lots of Facebook posts say that it cures cancer. Lots of Facebook posts say that Amazonian jungle fruit cures cancer because it's a good idea to eat lots of it. So which one makes more sense? Sorry, and I read it wrong with, I wanted to say causes cancer instead of cures. Which one makes more sense? Which is providing support for which? It's number 3. it's the one on the list. If you're reading the lecture notes, I said 3. It's this one. It's a good idea to eat lots of Amazonian jungle fruit because lots of Facebook posts say that it cures cancer. Right? The other one doesn't really make sense. Lots of Facebook posts say that Amazonian jungle fruit cures cancer because it's a good idea to eat lots of it. Right? That feels backwards. It doesn't work, right? They're saying it cures cancer because it's a good idea to eat it versus it cures, it's a good idea to eat a lot of it because it cures cancer, right? If you break it down and to its base, you should be able to use because to determine which actually is supporting the claim and which one is not. Just when one sounds awkward, but also doesn't make sense if you're trying to say, like, lots of Facebook posts say that it cures cancer because it's a good idea to eat it, right? That should automatically be like, wait, how would it cure cancer because it's a good idea to eat it versus it's a good idea to eat it because it cures cancer, right? That can, again, not always, but can be super helpful in determining, if you use these 4 things, on what the conclusion. And like I said, if you can determine what the conclusion is, go to the next one here. PowerPoint is being funky here. Oh, we'll try in just a second. It doesn't like what I was doing. If you can find out what the conclusion is, then it helps you find and figure out the premise and the process. There we go. Very slow. I clicked on that like a minute ago. Okay, we're going to get into more detail next time on deductive and inductive arguments. So I'm giving a super quick overview here because we're going to delve into that way more with this. But it is important to know deductive arguments are arguments in which the premises are meant to provide conclusive logical support for the conclusion. That's that idea, right? A deductive argument that succeeds in providing logical support is said to be valid, and an argument that fails to provide it is said to be invalid. So we're going to be looking at that too, right? And this is important because this is where some things it's like, that's not correct, but it doesn't matter because you can have a valid argument that still technically is wrong. And this is where this can get confusion, right? Just because the conclusion is true doesn't mean the argument is in support of the conclusion, that the conclusion is a good one. So if you have, you can have like a conclusion that is true, but the premise is bad, right? Truth and justification are 2 different things. A deductive argument that is said to be valid, if it isn't possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. That's super important here with this. And I put them down here too with this. We'll look at those in just a second. But the idea that essentially with a deductive argument, this idea of a valid deductive argument, if you accept the premise to be true. So you could have something false, like all humans are mortal, okay? And if all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. The idea with deductive arguments is that essentially if the premise, PowerPoint is freaking out on me. If the premise, like you don't have to believe it, but if you say, if the premise is true, then the conclusion has to be true, right? You can't have a true premise and not have a true conclusion, right? You can disagree with it and stuff like that. But so to give an example of a valid deductive argument with that, right? All dogs have fleas. Bowser is a dog. So Bowser has fleas. Now, you could argue, well, all dogs don't have fleas, but that's not the point. Looking at the premise, if we just accept, the idea is you kind of have to say, okay, if I accept that all dogs have fleas and that Bowser is a dog, the conclusion has to be true, that Bowser has fleas. It's a separate issue to get into an argument of saying, well, not all dogs have fleas, right? But this is a deductive valid argument because if I accept the premise that all dogs have fleas and Bowser is a dog, the conclusion has to be that. It can't be false. So hopefully that makes sense. Versus an invalid deductive argument, all dogs are mammals, all cows are mammals, therefore all dogs are cows. Right? That doesn't work. Even if you accept all dogs are mammals and all cows are mammals, it doesn't work. It's an invalid argument because the conclusion is not the logical conclusion to that statement, right? All dogs are cows. Just because two different animals are mammals doesn't mean they're the same animal. And that's what that argument is saying. I don't know what happened to PowerPoint here, so I'll just finish up. And you can, oh, there we go. It went to the next one finally. With this, inductive arguments are essentially, they're as I mentioned, risky arguments. Essentially, it's the idea that the premise of good inductive arguments do not demonstrate their conclusions, they support them. So an example of this is that a woman has been found murdered. The husband is known to have threatened her repeatedly. Right? This fact doesn't actually demonstrate that the woman's husband murdered her by itself. It supports it slightly. Basically, it's a level of probability, right? 10% of all customers in this restaurant order soda. John is a customer. John will not order soda. Right? Yes, that conclusion is a possibility because 10% of all customers don't order soda. 10% of customers order soda. So statistically, if only 10% of customers order soda, John probably will not order soda because he's a customer. But that's just one probable. It's not a guaranteed, like with the deductive. The idea is, and I don't want to go back at this point because I'm kind of afraid if I click on it, it's gonna freeze up. But this idea, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. If we accept that all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, the conclusion has to be true, right? There's no probably, maybe. Yeah, it could be. In inductive arguments, there's the probably, maybe, could be, right? 10% of all customers in this restaurant order soda. John is a customer. John will not order soda. Well, okay, another example right here. The sun has risen every morning throughout history. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. This one's a stronger inductive argument than the soda one. Yeah, probably. If the sun has risen every morning, there's a very, very good chance that the sun will rise tomorrow. But the world could end. Something could happen that causes the sun not to rise, right? It's not 100%, where the deductive argument, it's basically the idea that it's 100% of that. Right? Essentially with inductive arguments, it's a matter of degrees, where it can be a little bit like the John will not order a soda, there's a small possibility, to a whole lot. If we go back to the murderer one, a woman who has been found murdered, the husband is known to have threatened her repeatedly. Well, if the husband has threatened her repeatedly, that's someone that you would want to look at, but you can't. It's not 100% that he is the murderer. However, if you had a sentence that said the husband's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, the fact would then be a much better support for the conclusion. Inductive arguments essentially are on a better or worse scale, essentially, depending on how much they support their premise. So in deductive arguments, and I'm sorry, like it doesn't want to go to the next thing here on the PowerPoint. It kind of froze up. But that's just the last two. You can look at them. Deductive arguments are either valid or invalid, right? Based on because again, the key, here we go, finally, right? This idea that with deductive ones, right, it is impossible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. That's a valid deductive argument. So, for example, all dogs have fleas, Bowser is a dog. If that premise is true, the conclusion has to be true. An invalid deductive argument is, or where it doesn't work, is all dogs are mammals, all cows are mammals, therefore all dogs are cows. Well, that can't be a valid deductive argument because it doesn't work. It's wrong, right? Now, you can have, again, if you look at the valid deductive argument here, all dogs have fleas. This is not a sound valid deductive argument, right? If the premise of a valid argument is in fact true, then it's sound. So you can have a valid sound argument for deductive arguments. But in this case, this is just valid. And this is where it gets confusing because we want to actually be like, well, all dogs don't have fleas, so that's false or that's invalid. Nope. It is still a valid deductive argument because these two premises, then this conclusion has to be true if we agree with it, right? If I were to just set aside and say, yes, these two premises, if they're true, then the conclusion has to be true. It makes it a valid deductive argument. It's not sound, though, right? If all dogs did, in fact, have fleas, then it would be a sound argument. So hopefully that makes sense in how that difference is. It's because sometimes I think we want to naturally be like, oh, well, we can't call it valid. It's incorrect, right? No, not all dogs have fleas. But the key with this is that the key is the sound part, right? You can say, yeah, it's valid because if I accept the premise as true, the conclusion has to be true. Now, if I want to say it's sound, then it has to actually be factually accurate as well. Invalid means the premises, these two here do not equal, right, the conclusion. Therefore, it cannot be a valid deductive argument. And then for inductive arguments, it's usually considered strong and weak inductive argument. So an inductive argument that succeeds in providing probable, again, inductive is probable, not conclusive logical support, is strong. An inductive argument that fails to provide such support is weak. So again, here now you have strong and weak versus valid and invalid. So a strong argument. Most dogs have fleas. Therefore, Bowser, my dog, probably has fleas. It's probable, if most dogs have fleas, that my dog would have fleas, right? Here's another strong one. 98% of humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is likely to be mortal, right? The small percentage of humans that are immortal, apparently. Right, but if you say, okay, if 98% of humans are mortal and Socrates is human, it is likely that Socrates is mortal then. Week one, at least one dog in this town has rabies. Fido is a dog that lives in this town, therefore Fido has rabies. That's probably not true at all. If only one dog has rabies in the town, it's not probable that the other dogs all have rabies too, just because Fido's a dog. So that's a weak inductive argument. There's still a small possibility of probability. And that's the key difference between inductive and deductive. Deductive is basically, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. For it to be an actual deductive argument, which we saw with this other one here, right? The premises, even if we say, okay, if let's say the two premises are true, all dogs are mammals, all cows are mammals. This is not the logical conclusion of those premises. It doesn't work. But with inductive, it's all about probability. Essentially, could it be true? That's the way to think of it. Could it be true? Yeah. And it's on a sliding scale. So again, strong ones that have logical support to it, and you can have even stronger. I think there's this sliding scale of strongness, if you will, of better to worse, essentially. You can have what's not the best strong argument, but it still be a strong inductive one. And then you can have, so there's levels, right? Most dogs have fleas, therefore my dog Bowser probably has fleas. Right, where on the sliding scale of probability is that? Right? And some are going to be more clear cut. Like, yeah, that's a good chance versus it's likely, right? But a weak one is when it doesn't provide support. So don't get those confused, right? If you're like, well, sure, there's a small chance. It still works out as a strong inductive argument. It's just a weak strong, if you will. Weak inductive arguments only happen when it doesn't provide the support, right? It can be a weak, strong inductive, and that's the confusing part, right? If there's any level of probability, yes, it could be true. It can be a strong argument. It's when it doesn't support it at all, right? Therefore, Fido has rabies. That's not a logical conclusion at all to one dog having rabies. That's not even like likely a probability in that sense. So that's where you get the weak versus strong. All right, I know this can be confusing somewhat on all the different options of that. What we're going to do next time is we're going to look at breaking down and mapping the argument so that you can sit there and say, how do I break this down sentence by sentence to figure out each of these aspects? And that will be the goal, which will help further in determining and being able to identify arguments.